Okay, you all see that?
Yes, it works. Great.
Good, good. Okay, so any society needs some method of decision-making, some kind of political system. The most common political system used in current-day bourgeois democracies is representative democracy. This system, however, has many serious defects. One of the biggest defects is that votes in supposedly representative bodies often don't reflect the views of a majority of the population. Now, that's, of course, a contradiction to the fundamental alleged goal of representative democracy. And so here's an example. The Trump administration in the United States had a tax bill. And according to a report at the time, a third of the voters supported the bill, and other surveys showed that opposition to the bill was much higher than any support. But yet, the vote in the House of Representatives, the representative body in the United States Congress, was 227 to 205. Okay, that was more than a 52% majority in support of a bill that a majority of the population did not support. Consider the Biden administration's current COVID relief stimulus package. Polls showed that 3 out of 4 voters backed this package. Okay, that's overwhelming support. 3 out of 4 voters. In fact, even among Republican voters, 60% either support strongly or somewhat support. But despite this overwhelming public support, even among Republican voters, here was the roll call vote. It just narrowly squeaked by in the House of Representatives. So again, the representative body isn't actually doing a very good job of representing the wishes and the political views of the population. Now, so what accounts for this divergence between the views of the public and the views of the representative body? So here are a couple of reasons in the United States today: gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the role of money. So gerrymandering means drawing political districts in such a way as to benefit one party or another. So it was estimated that in 2010, 59 seats, this is in a body of 435 seats, 59 seats are shifted per election due to partisan gerrymandering. This little diagram here shows you how you can do it. Here you have a population that is 60% blue and 40% red, but then you could draw the district lines this way so that you get 5 blue and 0 red, or you could draw the district lines this way so you actually get 3 red and 2 blues. So by clever, devious drawing of the lines, a population that is 60% blue ends up with 60% red representatives. So that's one problem with representative government, at least in the United States, where each state is allowed in a partisan way to draw district lines. A second reason that representatives don't represent people is because of voter suppression. The Government Accountability Office, this is a branch of the US government, estimates that voting turnout is decreased 2 to 3% as a result of voter ID laws. These laws say in order to vote, you must present certain kinds of identification, but these are kinds of identification that older people, students, poor people, Black people are less likely to have. And that alone, those kinds of laws that some states impose, and the states that impose these laws are, in particular, the states that for 150 years denied African Americans the right to vote. It's very much concentrated in those states. It's estimated that this cuts turnout by 2 to 3%. Another tactic is disproportionately closing polling places in minority communities. So in this 4-year period, in states that had previously denied African Americans the right to vote, 1,200 polling places were closed by the authorities, thinking that if you only have a few voting places in African American neighborhoods, the lines will be long, people will get discouraged, and voting turnout will go down. And finally, purging voter rolls. Now, there's some sense in which you go through voter rolls and make sure that if somebody has died or somebody has moved, they no longer are on the voting roll. But the vote purging takes place in a very partisan way. And the results are that, particularly in states that had previously denied African Americans the right to vote, 2 million fewer voters would have been purged if these jurisdictions did the same purging that most jurisdictions did, the same kind of cleaning up that most did. And finally, of course, there's the role of money. Countless studies have shown that money makes a difference in the outcome of elections. Here's just one study that concluded that money interests exert remarkably effective control over the passage of contested bills. Money matters, and therefore the people's will is not being reflected. Now, here's the thing. Even if there were no gerrymandering, no voter suppression, no vote buying, representative bodies will still not always represent the views of the people. So all the criticisms I've made of representative government so far could be fixed within the structure of a representative government. We used to have rules in the United States that limited some of these practices, though the Supreme Court has recently removed some of those limitations. But even if you got rid of all of these problems, representative government is still not representative. Here's why. Imagine a country that has 5 regions, and each region has exactly 20 voters. So there are a total of 100 voters in the country. Now assume that there are 2 political parties in the country, red and green, and their number of supporters is indicated below. So in this district, in this region, there are 12 red voters and 8 green, 12 red and 8 green, 12 red and 8 green. Here, 4 red and 16 green. And in the last one, again, 4 red and 16 green. If you add up all the red and green votes, you have 44 red voters and 56 green voters. So the green voters have a pretty decisive edge. But if each region elects a representative to send to the parliament, the Congress, the legislature, in this district, since there are 12 red and 8 green, they will send a red representative. Here, they will send a red representative. Here, they will send a red representative. Here, green, and here, green. So the representatives are 60% red, but the population is 56% green. So you have a mismatch between the people and their representatives. Now, there's another reason that the views of representatives might not correspond to the views of their constituents. When a voter votes for a candidate, that doesn't mean that the voter agrees with the candidate on every issue. What it means is that you agree more with that candidate than you don't agree, or you agree more with that candidate than you do with another candidate. Okay, so this looks like a really crazy table, but I think it illustrates the point after some explanation pretty clearly. Consider this case where there are two candidates, A and B, and there are 20 voters, and there are 10 issues. Okay? So candidate A is in favor of every one of these positions. Candidate B is opposed on every one of these issues. And that won't always happen. You'll sometimes have candidates with overlap, but in this case, you've got candidate A with 10 yeses and candidate B with 10 noes. Now, for some voters, like voter number 1, their views are yes, 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 all the way down. That matches precisely with candidate A. Okay, so they agree on 10, they disagree on none with candidate A, and agree on with B on 0. So their vote is easy. They're going to vote for candidate A. And on the other side, voter 20, who favors noes all the way down, they've got an easy choice too. They're going to favor candidate B because they line up exactly with candidate B. But not all voters find their views align perfectly with one of the candidates. So they will vote for the candidate whose views are closest to their own. So look here at voter 6. Voter 6 position is yes, 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 no, no, yes, 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 yes. So there are 2 no's in there. So who does this voter vote for? Well, they agree with candidate A on 8 issues, and they agree with candidate B on 2 issues. So they're likely to vote for candidate A. Now, obviously, it might be that some issues are much more important than others. So in this example, we're simplifying by assuming all the issues are equally important. Okay, so for voter 6, it's a pretty straightforward decision to vote for candidate A. For voter 7, same thing. For voter 12, yes, 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 and then 4 no's, still 6-4, they'll vote for A. And so, as you can see, there are 15 votes for candidate A, 5 votes for candidate C. And therefore, these voters will elect as their representative candidate A. 15 out of 20, that's a pretty, hefty vote. So candidate A will be elected. But on some issues, candidate A does not properly represent these 20 voters. In particular, if you look at issues 4 and 5, you can see that 11 out of the 20 voters, 11 to 9, take a no position on both issue 4 and 5, but the candidate who represents them takes a yes position. So again, on that issue 4 and on issue 5, on both of those issues, the voters and their representatives do not line up. So on some fraction of issues, representatives who have been fairly elected will not represent their constituents. Okay? And note that if we had alternative voting systems like ranked choice voting, or if we had 3 candidates and 5 candidates, etc., none of those things would solve either of these problems that I've identified with representation. Another problem with representation is that typically representatives have 100,000 constituents or more. So it is impossible for the representative to personally know the constituent or for the constituent to know the representative. In the United States, each representative represents 700,000 people. In other countries, it varies, but most are over 100,000. And that's much as we all have lots of Facebook friends, etc. Most of us don't have 100,000 people that we know personally. There's another problem with representative democracy, even ignoring the problem of corrupt or lying representatives, which I haven't discussed. Representative democracy treats politics as strictly instrumental. That is, it's a means to an end. It's a way to achieve a decision, but it's not a value in its own right. But in fact, political participation is intrinsically worthwhile. It gives people the experience of controlling their own lives. The more that the task of thinking about how we can collectively manage our lives is delegated to others, the less knowledgeable we become regarding our society, the less we determine our own destinies, and the weaker our ties of solidarity to our fellow citizens. Adam Smith's famous comments on the mindless workplace apply also to mindless voting for representatives. Smith said, "The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations of which the effects too are perhaps always the same or always nearly the same has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become." And the same thing happens with voting. If we let others do the politics for us, we become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become, and we have fewer ties and understanding of our fellow human beings. So because of all these defects in representative democracy, many have proposed that we adopt some form of direct or participatory democracy. Under direct democracy, people make decisions themselves rather than choosing others to do it for them. There are several forms of direct democracy. One of them is referendum democracy, where every issue is put to the population as a whole. Now, in the past, such an approach was impossible. There was no mechanism for allowing large numbers of people to cast ballots on a nearly daily basis. But modern technology makes this possible on a vast scale. People could use the internet first to access as much background information as they wanted, so they would be informed voters, and then they could vote on their preferred options. But even if technically possible, would we really want to spend so much time exhaustively studying the many hundreds of issues that national legislatures currently take up each year? Those legislators are doing this more or less full time. Do we all want to invest that same amount of time while doing some other job as well? Legislators typically have a staff to make the work manageable. Would each citizen have a staff person? Clearly, some means is needed to separate the important issues out from all the other rather routine issues that legislators currently deal with. But there are other problems with referendum democracy as well. Who formulates the referendum questions? Since we know the wording of a question matters a great deal. With referendums, one votes an issue up or down. There's no opportunity for deliberation, for compromise, for trying to find a consensus. Politics produces people as well as decisions. People who make decisions only via referendums have no experience deliberating and compromising with their fellow citizens, and thus don't build bonds of solidarity with them. Now, this is actually one of the strengths of representative bodies. Deliberation is a key feature of representative bodies. One doesn't have to credit the often nearly empty US Senate with being the world's greatest deliberative body to recognize that it is true that representative bodies do afford an opportunity to deliberate, to consider the implications of a proposed course of action, and to seek refinements, compromises, and consensus, something that referendums don't do and can't do. So there's another form of democracy, another form of direct democracy, autonomous communities. Fully autonomous communities, small communities, are a way to combine the benefits of participation and the benefits of deliberation. But there are several problems with autonomous communities. First is the question of size. Either they are too small and thus can't function effectively or provide adequate diversity, or they'll be too large to permit face-to-face direct democracy. A meeting of thousands or even hundreds of people is not typically a very deliberative, participatory experience. The second difficulty with autonomous communities is that many problems are not susceptible to small-scale solutions. For example, dealing with environmental problems or pandemics or building a dam. Now, to be sure, autonomous communities could reach voluntary agreements with one another to address these problems. But sharing and cooperation need some decision-making procedure. If the agreement of all is required, since the communities are autonomous, there will be times when the self-interest of one community will prevent an agreement that is in the best interest of the majority, even the vast majority of communities. For example, one community might opt to expand an industry that pollutes a river, harming many downstream communities. Now, obviously, most everyone in a good society will be environmentally conscious, but there are trade-offs, and downstream and upstream communities may not all weigh the benefits and harms in the same way. So we still need some authoritative decision-making mechanism. And this then brings us to a third form of direct democracy, the one that I advocate, nested councils. This rejects both the autonomous community and the referendum models, and instead has small councils linked to one another. The basic idea is this: everyone gets to participate in a primary council. The council is small enough for face-to-face decision-making and real deliberation. Many decisions will be made in these councils because the decision affects only or overwhelmingly the members of that council. But because there are many decisions that affect more than people in a single council, the councils affected will have to coordinate their decision-making. This means the councils will have to send delegates to a higher level council. And if the decision affects more than one of these higher level councils and the population that lives within that council, they would in turn send delegates to a third level council, and so on. How large would these councils be? That would be decided on the basis of a society-wide decision based on experience, revised as time went on. But the basic idea would be this: the councils would be small enough to guarantee that people can be involved in a deliberative procedure, face-to-face discussions, but also big enough so there is adequate diversity of opinion included, and so that the number of layers needed to accommodate the entire society is minimized. If each council had 25 members, and you assume that half the population is adults, 5 layers of councils could accommodate a society of 19 million. With councils of 40 members, 5 layers could accommodate 200 million. So these are manageable numbers for societies of populations we have now. The procedures and cultures of these councils would emphasize discussion and accommodation rather than scoring debaters' points and vanquishing one's opponents. Participants would be expected to give reasons for their views framed in terms of the public good rather than self-interest. Crucially, the councils would operate by consensus where possible, but majority rule where not. The problem with just relying on consensus because you respect people's opinions and you want to take them seriously, is that you also want to respect the views of the majority. In fact, you want to have more respect for the views of the majority than you do for the views of the minority, because there are more people in the majority. So you strive for consensus because that builds solidarity and understanding. But when necessary, you then use majority rule. The delegates from one council to the next would be charged with trying to reflect the actual views of the council they came from. But they would not be mandated. That is, they would not be told, this is how you must vote. For if they were mandated, then the higher council they would be attending would not be a deliberative body. There would be no point in having debate because everybody has to vote the way they've been told to vote. In fact, if you mandate delegates, the delegates could easily be replaced by a computer message relaying the sentiments of the lower council. But though not mandated, these delegates would be much more representative of the people they are supposed to represent than in standard representative systems. They are chosen by a small council whose members know them personally. The delegates are part of and constantly returning to their sending council. The delegates are rotated, so no one delegate serves too long. And the delegates are subject to immediate recall whenever the sending council no longer feels the delegate represents them. Most importantly, however, what prevents the unmandated delegates from usurping power is that the higher councils will only vote on matters that are relatively non-controversial. Whenever a vote is close, or when enough citizens or lower councils insist, the issue is returned to the lower councils for a decision. So delegates go up to higher level councils, deliberation takes place, refinement, compromise. If eventually no consensus can be reached and a vote is needed, if the vote is one-sided, that's fine. But if the vote is close, might this represent that same issue of indirect election that plagues representative democracy as well? To avoid that, you go back to the primary lower level councils for a decision, but not for every case, just for the cases that fall in these special categories. Note that this procedure eliminates the problem discussed earlier of representative body. If on some issue 13 delegates from councils with a slight majority in favor of a policy face 12 delegates from councils overwhelmingly against the policy, in that case, if the upper level council voted, the vote is 13-2. But if you go back to the lower level councils, a clear majority oppose the policy. So going back to the lower level council gives you the views of the population, not just the views of the representatives or the delegates. So having the lower level councils decide is more democratic. So you might say, why not send every issue back to the lower level councils for decision? And this is where our concern to avoid overdoing participation with excessive time demands comes in. By sending back contentious issues or those so requested by the citizens or the lower level councils, we have a check on abuse of power by the delegates to the higher level councils. But to send everything back would simply be a waste of time. It would be unmanageable. It would have the same problem as if we voted on every single decision every time. So far, I've been talking about how we need to defer to the majority. We reject a political system where the rich or the well-born or the meritocratic rule over the majority. So in that respect, of course, we favor majority rule. On the other hand, we also care about the rights of the minority. The majority should not have the right to oppress the minority or tell the minority what it can say or think or believe. Any good society will have restrictions on the majority entrenched in some sort of constitution. So, a constitution might say you have freedom of religion. The majority can't vote that we should all be this religion. That's just beyond the right of the majority to do. So if you've got a constitution, does that solve the problem? Well, no brief document is going to be able to provide a full elaboration of what these rights entail. So we'll need some means of interpreting the Constitution, a task performed in many countries by a Supreme Court or a High Court. But choosing the judges for these courts presents a real dilemma for democratic theory. If the judges or justices are appointed or chosen by some system of indirect election, particularly if they have long or even life terms, then they are removed from majority control, and they may not reflect the views of the majority of the population. For example, in the United States today, the Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, is far to the right of the US population. On the other hand, if judges are directly elected by majority rule, then they'll reflect the views and passions of the majority and not provide strong protection for the rights of unpopular minorities. So the way that I propose to address this dilemma, which is a dilemma across the board in democratic theory, is analogous to the model of the US jury. The US jury is chosen randomly from the population. And so in the same way, I would propose choosing a small group at random from the population to constitute council courts. These courts will review decisions made by councils to see if they interfere with basic rights and constitutional protections. Like current day juries, these courts will be deliberative bodies, though unlike juries, they would have a longer term than a single case, perhaps staggered 2-year terms. As a cross-section of the population, these council courts will be democratic bodies serving to check the democratic councils. The logic here makes use of a social science finding that when people make decisions through a deliberative process, the result is likely to be less intolerant than a simple poll of public opinion. Redesigning political institutions alone can't assure a decent political system. A good political system needs a good economic system. To put this in another way, without an economic system that is equitable, democratic, and participatory, no political system will be able to offer the values we seek. But if we have a participatory economy with equity in terms of gender, sexuality, and national, ethnic, and religious differences, then a system of nested councils seems an appropriate political structure. Nested councils can only achieve democracy, participation, and equality, however, if 1, issues can, whenever desired, be returned to the primary council level for decision, and 2, if there is a means of protecting minority rights that is consistent with majority rule, such as by using a random selected group of citizens.